Hi everyone, my name is Katherine Atwell and I'm a second year computer science PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh. Today I will be presenting my paper, Where Are We in Discourse Relation Recognition? I am working under Dr. Alikhani, who is a co-author on this paper, and we collaborated with Dr. Jessy from UT Austin for this work. So first, I'm going to start by briefly talking about the importance of discourse analysis for NLP problems. So we can see this example here, which is a review. While this book is totally different from any other book he has written to date, it did not disappoint me at all. The first part of this sentence could be considered negative. The book is different from the author's previous works, which might be off-putting for fans. However, the second part of the sentence is in direct contrast to this slightly negative tone. The reviewer was not disappointed by the book. It is difficult for a machine, given these two text units with different sentiments, to know whether the overall tone of the sentence is positive or negative. However, discourse analysis can let the machine know that this is a concession relation, where the second half of the sentence outweighs the first. Thus, this sentence has a positive meaning overall. Without discourse analysis, it can be difficult to pick up on these subtle details. There are clearly many important inferences that we can gain from these tools. Indeed, works across machine comprehension, summarization, and sentiment analysis have all found discourse features to be useful. But few works have found discourse relations to be useful key features. There are a couple of reasons why this could be. For one, discourse parsing is a very difficult task, and parsers still don't have high F1 scores, with even state-of-the-art models still having F1 scores below 50%. Parsers are also trained on a very narrow training set, 10 tree bank articles, which are Wall Street Journal articles collected over a 3-year period starting in 1989. If you try to run these models on, say, a corpus of movie reviews, you can see why this may cause the performance to be that much worse. So our goal is to study the performance of discourse parsing models on different linguistic distributions. We focus first on a distributional shift in linguistic structure, aka whether the arguments are intersentential or intrasentential. Then we look at performance under a distributional shift in vocabulary. How do these parsers perform on data with various shifts in domain away from the test set? We also wish to identify where these parsers are having issues and determine why this could be. So we study the effects of domain and structural shift on performance of state-of-the-art models for two different discourse frameworks. The first one is the Penn discourse tree bank, which uses only the two arguments and a connected to determine the discourse relations. For our first example, which should be annotated in the style of the Penn discourse tree bank, with the first argument being in italics and the second argument being in bold font, it would be considered an explicit relation, where a connective, in this case while, is included in the text. However, let's look at this example here. A Laura Lard spokeswoman said, "This is an old story. We're talking about years ago before anyone heard of asbestos having any questionable properties." There's no connective in this text to determine the discourse relation. However, one can be logically inserted without changing the meaning of the passage. In this case, that connective is in fact. This is called an implicit discourse relation, which will be the main focus of this paper when studying the Penn discourse tree bank due to the difficulty of classifying implicit relations. And as a quick note, the PDTV3, which was recently released, contains implicit relations where both arguments are in the same sentence, unlike the PDTV2. This will be an important distinction for this project. The second framework that we study for this project is the RST discourse tree bank, where discourse relations in the text form a tree structure, as in this example here. Each of the segments in this tree are what's known as elementary discourse units. The RST discourse tree bank does not differentiate between implicit and explicit relations and does not label discourse connectives. A third discourse framework is segmented discourse representation theory, or SDRT, which assigns a rhetorical relation a dynamic semantic interpretation. This example here is an example of an SDRT graph. Because there are very few parsers available for SDRT relations, we do not focus on this framework in this project, but we did think that it was worth mentioning. The data sets that we use to study the effects of domain shift are Wall Street Journal articles, which are from the 1940s to the 1970s from the corpus of historical American English and are outside of the years of the Penn Tree Bank. Other news articles from this same set that are not Wall Street Journal articles, but are also from the 1940s to the 1970s. And the gum corpus, which contains gold RST labels for 8 different genres of text. So in order to study the performance of these models on intersentential versus intrasentential discourse relations, we split the PDTB3 and RST test sets into intersentential and intrasentential relations and study the performance of the models on these sets. For the RST, we excluded relations between more than 2 sentences, as it is known that relations higher up in the tree suffer from performance issues. To study the effect of domain shift on plain text documents for the Penn Discourse Tree Bank, we had annotators manually annotate articles from our 3 sets, Wall Street Journal, other news articles, and the gum corpus, and compared the output of the parsers to these annotations. For the RST Discourse Tree Bank, we reported the results of the parser on the gold labeled gum corpus, as well as the RST Discourse Tree Bank test set. So these are the 3 models that we use, all of which are state-of-the-art. So for the Penn Discourse Tree Bank, we use an end-to-end parser that is one of the more recent end-to-end parsing models. And then for classifying implicit discourse senses, we also look at the Disco Eval BERT-based model. And then for the RST Discourse Tree Bank, we use a single parser, the Wang 2017 parser. So for our manual annotation, which we use to measure the accuracy of the parsers under domain shift, we had 2 annotators who were trained on the PDTB2 annotation manual and were only given the full arguments in front of them, but they also did have full access to the text of each article if needed. The relations were sampled from our 3 data sets at random, and there were 64 implicit discourse relations in total. So we'll go into some takeaways from our experiments. The first thing we found is that models do better on intrasentential relations than they do on intersentential relations across frameworks. So we can see here in this chart that the model that was trained and tested on the PDTB3, which contains intrasentential discourse relations, unlike the PDTB2, performs better, and that the model trained on the PDTB3 and tested only on the intrasentential relations in the PDTB3 performs the best. So we see this pattern for the RST as well, where the model tested on intrasentential relations outperforms the model tested on intersentential relations for every discourse sense. So our next takeaway here is that parsers struggle to identify implicit relations from less frequent classes. For this analysis in particular, we show the number of times the parsers predicted each of the different discourse senses. And from the graphs, we omit the classes that were not predicted at all by the parser. So as you can see here, our end-to-end parser only recognizes 5 out of the 16 total level 2 PDTB senses in any of our 3 domains for implicit discourse relations. So the BERT-based Disco Eval model does better in this regard, and it predicts a total of 9 out of the 16 level 2 senses at least once. Although as you can see from this graph, it still predicts a pretty overwhelmingly large amount of contingency.cause relations for all 3 domains. So for the RST, the parser predicts almost all of the 18 sense classes at least once, which is good, but the vast majority of the predictions are for the top 3 classes, aka elaboration, attribution, and same unit. So our third takeaway from our experiments is that these models are pretty bad at predicting results for both in-domain and out-of-domain data. So in these 2 graphs here, we report the accuracies of the PDTB parsers against our manually annotated data in terms of level 1 accuracy and level 2 accuracy. So we look at the percentage of times that the models did not get anything right, only got the level 1 sense right, and got the level 2 sense right. So we can see here that for both of these parsers, the accuracies were pretty low for each domain, which is pretty surprising. You'd expect the parsers to do well in these articles from at least the articles from the source domain, the Wall Street Journal articles, but we see here that this isn't the case. So we can also see that when testing the parser against gold data from the RST set and the GUM corpus, that the RST parser performs worse on the GUM corpus data than on the RST set overall and across most of the relations, which corroborates the takeaway that parsers do not do well on texts outside of the source domain. This is what we expected and falls under what we were expecting. So in addition to these takeaways, we found some insights that may benefit future model development. Our first insight is that our annotators noticed something that our annotators noticed, which is that there were times when they needed additional article text in order to properly annotate the correct relation. So an example of this is provided here. In this northern latitude, it doesn't get dark in summer until about 10:30 p.m., so lighting is operate except at some crazy time like 11:45 at night, whenever there is power, unless they have standby diesel generators. There's a year's supply of diesel oil here. So the annotator's original label was contingency.condition. As with only the two arguments, it seems as though argument 2 makes it possible for argument 1 to be true. However, when provided with additional context, it is clear that the presence of a year's supply of diesel oil is in contrast to the lack of power available to people. Therefore, the revised label was comparison.contrast. So we hypothesized that adding context may be helpful for future models to make this distinction. We also noticed that there were attachment issues throughout the RST parse tree, and relations were often misclassified as same unit and elaboration. So you can see that this is the case in this RST parse tree here. We have already seen in the previous slides that models predict same unit and elaboration relations at very high rates. So this suggests that models may be overconfident in predicting these relations in particular. So to recap, here are some of the main takeaways from our results. For one, models are more easily able to predict intrasentential discourse relations when compared to intersentential discourse relations. Secondly, class imbalance makes it difficult for models to learn features of underrepresented classes. And then lastly, discourse parsers appear to struggle under any kind of domain shift away from a test set. And more research will need to be done as to why this is the case. This in particular was a surprising result for us. So some important next steps for future models are two. One, address class imbalance issues in these annotated data sets. Two, incorporate more context beyond the two arguments into parsing models. And then lastly, and this is kind of an eventual goal, develop unsupervised approaches to classifying discourse relations that do not require these large amounts of annotated data. So thank you all very much for watching. My contact information is below if you have any questions.